The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that hums in your ears, that sticks to your skin like static. No one spoke. Not the judge, not the attorneys, not the man in the orange jumpsuit shackled at the wrists, and not the dog. At the foot of the defense table sat Shadow, a black German shepherd with amber eyes, motionless, alert, and impossibly still, like a statue carved from loyalty itself. He didn't blink, didn't pant, didn't move, but he watched. Every word, every breath, every lie. The prosecution cleared their throat. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Officer Alan Rowe was found dead at his own home. The defendant, his partner, was the last person to see him alive. The courtroom didn't shift, didn't gasp, because they'd already heard this before. But Shadow, his ears twitched. Just once. Barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. At the defense table, the accused, Detective Michael Graves, didn't look at the jury. He looked at the dog. I didn't do it, he whispered. And you know that. Shadow didn't respond, but his gaze didn't leave him either, like he was waiting. The judge leaned forward. Are we really allowing a dog in this courtroom as evidence? The defense attorney stood. He was Officer Rowe's K9, his partner. He was there that night, and he hasn't let anyone else near that house since. The judge narrowed his eyes. Shadow didn't move, but every single person in that room suddenly wondered, what did he see? And more importantly, why won't he look away? The old two-story house stood alone at the edge of the neighborhood. Yellow police tape flapped weakly in the wind. The porch light still flickered. No one had turned it off. No one had dared to, because Shadow was still there. Every morning, every night, sitting on the top step, eyes fixed on the door. Neighbors said he hadn't moved in days, didn't chase squirrels, didn't bark. He just waited. The officers had tried to leash him, tried to carry him away, tried to break the invisible chain that bound him to that door. But Shadow resisted. Not with teeth, not with violence, just refusal. He wouldn't leave. Not until someone understood. Flashback. 2 weeks earlier, Officer Alan Rowe came home late again. Same jacket, same tired eyes, but that night, his steps were heavier. Shadow noticed. He always noticed. They walked in silence, as they often did. One man, one dog, both trained to sense what words can't say. Alan stood in the kitchen, staring at a sealed envelope, one he'd never seen before. Shadow sat beside him. His ears twitched, his eyes narrowed, because something about that envelope smelled wrong. Alan didn't open it. He tucked it into a drawer, whispered, "Tomorrow." But there was no tomorrow. The next morning, officers found the front door slightly ajar, coffee still warm, chair knocked over, and Shadow sitting beside Alan's body, silent, guarding, grieving. When they reached for the body, Shadow growled, not from rage, from refusal. They had to sedate him just to move forward, but no one could explain what the coroner found next. A single paw print, pressed into the bloodied tile. Not smeared, not accidental, deliberate, like someone or something had tried to leave a message, and Shadow had been staring at that same spot ever since. The courtroom lights buzzed faintly overhead. The judge sipped his water. The prosecutor stood tall, suit sharp, voice sharper. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case built on facts. Officer Alan Rowe was murdered in his own home. His partner, Detective Graves, was the last one to see him alive. He walked slowly toward the defense table. Now we have a dog, a highly trained, loyal dog, who hasn't left that house, who hasn't accepted another handler. But let's not forget, dogs cannot speak. They cannot testify. He pointed at Shadow. What you see here is emotion. Instinct, not evidence. Shadow didn't flinch, but something shifted. The prosecutor turned his back and returned to his podium. We need to focus on logic, not loyalty. Shadow's ears flattened slightly. No one noticed, except one, Michael Graves, still seated, still handcuffed. But watching Shadow closely, he leaned forward and whispered under his breath, "They're wrong, you remember, don't you?" For the first time since the trial began, Shadow looked away from the door. He turned his head, slow, precise, and locked eyes with Graves. 1 second. 2. Then, Shadow stood up. Low growl. Not hostile. Focused. Everyone in the courtroom froze. Is that dog growling at my client? The prosecutor barked, but he wasn't. He wasn't growling at Graves. He was growling at the podium, at the place where the prosecutor had just stood, at the scent left behind. The judge's gavel slammed. Control that animal. But no one moved, because in that moment, it wasn't just a dog growling. It was a soldier, reacting to something no one else could detect. And for the first time, the courtroom began to wonder. Maybe the dog wasn't the one being questioned. Maybe he was doing the questioning. Shadow stood still, ears forward, eyes locked on the prosecution table. The courtroom held its breath. The judge adjusted his glasses. Defense, control your dog or I will order him removed. But the defense attorney didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. Because he saw it, too. Shadow wasn't confused. He wasn't aggressive. He was focused, tense, tracking. And the scent he followed wasn't coming from the accused. It was coming from something left behind. The prosecutor's leather briefcase. Shadow stepped forward. Just one paw, soft on the floor, barely audible. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Is he reacting to something? A bailiff moved in, hand near his belt. But the judge raised a hand. No, let him finish. Shadow lowered his head, nose inches from the briefcase. He inhaled deeply, slow and long. Then he turned and looked toward the jury. Not the defense, not the judge. The jury. And he sat, calm, controlled, but unmistakably deliberate. The prosecutor chuckled nervously. Your Honor, are we truly going to sit down? The judge said sharply. I want to hear this out. The defense attorney stepped forward. Shadow is trained to detect explosive residue, narcotics and human blood traces. If he's alerting to that briefcase, Your Honor, we may need to take a closer look. The judge nodded. Bailiff, open it. The courtroom tensed as the officer slowly unlatched the case. Inside, documents. A sealed evidence bag. A small bloodied cloth. The prosecutor froze. That's not supposed to be there. But Shadow didn't look at the cloth. He stared at the prosecutor's hand. Then his eyes shifted to a cut just beneath the cuff. Fresh, barely healing, and then back to the cloth. The message was clear. He remembered the smell, and it wasn't the defendant's. It was raining. Soft, steady, and cold. Officer Alan Rowe was in the living room, finishing a report. Shadow lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes half closed, body relaxed but aware. Then a knock at the door. Not loud, not rushed. Familiar. Rowe didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, looked through the peephole, and opened the door. Shadow lifted his head, ears perked, because he recognized the scent before the face. It was someone they knew. Someone Rowe trusted. Shadow didn't bark, didn't growl. He stood and walked calmly toward the door, tail still, breathing quiet. The man stepped inside, water dripping from his coat. They spoke in low tones, no shouting, no tension, but Shadow watched. The guest placed a hand on Rowe's shoulder. Too casual, too confident, and Rowe's expression changed. From ease to discomfort. That shift was small, but Shadow saw it, felt it, because dogs don't need words. They read tension in muscle, scent, air, and what he sensed in that room was wrong. Still, he stayed silent. He didn't interfere, not until the voices stopped, and the sound of glass shattering echoed through the room. Then, a cry, and silence again. When the officers arrived the next morning, Shadow was sitting in front of the body, chest covered in dried blood, unmoving. He hadn't barked, hadn't chased, because he hadn't been afraid, but his eyes, they told a different story. And now, in court, those same eyes were slowly starting to point at the man who'd come in from the rain. The defense attorney walked to the front of the court, his voice steady, measured. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to enter Shadow's service file into the record. The judge raised a brow. A dog's service file. The attorney nodded. He's not just a pet. He was a federally recognized law enforcement officer. Badge number K9. Assigned to Officer Rowe. Trained in scent tracking, protection, and threat response. He held up a thick folder. The prosecutor scoffed. Are we seriously submitting a dog's resume as evidence? The judge leaned forward. Proceed. The attorney continued. In over 6 years of service, Shadow was deployed to 47 active crime scenes, cleared 38 threat alerts, and received 2 commendations for saving lives in the line of duty. He looked down at the dog, still calm, still alert. He wasn't trained to act on command alone. He was trained to assess, react, and remember. He paused. On the night Officer Rowe was killed, Shadow didn't attack. He didn't bark, because the person who entered that house wasn't a stranger. He was someone Shadow recognized. A hush fell over the room. The attorney turned to the jury, and yet ever since that night, he hasn't returned to normal. He refused food, refused transport, and when brought to the crime scene, he sat in one exact spot over a blood trail that didn't belong to the victim. He walked to the evidence screen. A photo appeared. Shadow seated next to a smear of blood, dried separate from where Officer Rowe fell. Another file opened. DNA results. The blood sample matched neither the victim. Gasps. Whispers. The prosecutor stood, flustered. That could have come from anyone. But it didn't, the defense attorney said, voice rising. He turned to the bailiff. Bring in the briefcase. The bailiff returned with the leather bag Shadow had alerted on earlier. The defense attorney lifted a swab, wiped the inner lining, then handed it to the forensics officer standing by. Test that. I'll wait. Shadow didn't move, didn't blink. He already knew the result, because he remembered the scent, and he never forget. The courtroom was still, like the air had thickened, like everyone was holding the same breath at the same time. Shadow sat, eyes fixed, not on the defendant, not on the judge, but the prosecutor. The forensics officer held up the swab from the briefcase, his voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the tension. Positive, human blood. A match to the unknown sample found at the crime scene. A ripple passed through the courtroom. Some jurors leaned forward, others exchanged looks. The prosecutor shifted. That doesn't prove anything, he said. A little too fast. Cross-contamination, chain of custody. This is circumstantial. But he wouldn't meet Shadow's gaze, because Shadow wasn't looking away. He sat tall, shoulders straight, ears forward, and stared, unblinking, unmoving, unrelenting. It wasn't aggression, it was recognition. And something more, betrayal. The judge turned to the prosecutor. Mr. Kerr, is there a reason your DNA was present at the victim's house, in a place you never disclosed visiting? Silence. Shadow stood, took 2 steps forward, and sat again, closer now. Eyes still locked. The prosecutor's lips parted, but no sound came. Matt. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, took a step back, but Shadow stepped forward once more. And the courtroom felt it. Truth wasn't just spoken, it was seen, felt, witnessed, by a dog who'd lost his partner, and would never stop telling the story until someone finally listened. And now, they were. The prosecutor's hand trembled. Just a little, but Shadow saw it. So did the jury. The judge leaned forward, voice low but firm. Mr. Kerr, I'll ask again. Did you visit Officer Rowe's home on the night he was killed? The prosecutor's eyes darted. To the bailiff, to the jury, to the dog. I had stopped by earlier that day. He wasn't home. I left a file. The defense attorney stepped in. Then why didn't you report that visit? Why did your blood end up on the floor? Why did Shadow Rowe's own partner react to your scent, and only your scent, since that night? Mr. Kerr opened his mouth, but there was no explanation. Only the sound of silence. and a low growl. Shadow was standing again, closer than before. Still not lunging, still not aggressive, but locked in position like a soldier awaiting permission. The judge turned to the bailiff. "Escort the prosecutor to the holding room. I'm calling for recess and ordering a full forensic review." Gasps. Chairs shifted. Reporters scribbled notes like wildfire. The courtroom was breaking apart, and at the center of it stood a dog. No badge, no words, just memory. And as Mr. Kerr was led away, he dared one last glance at Shadow. The dog didn't blink, didn't move, just watched him go. Because Shadow had done his part. He didn't bark. He didn't attack. He remembered, and sometimes that's all it takes to bring a lie to its knees. The courtroom reconvened 2 days later. This time, there were no cameras, no crowd murmurs, no press flashes, just silence. But not the same silence as before. This one felt clean, like something had been swept away. The prosecutor's table was empty. Mr. Kerr had resigned, pending criminal charges. New evidence had linked him to embezzlement, falsification of records, and now possibly to murder. The jury filed in, faces solemn, but sure. The judge looked up. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor. In the case of the People versus Detective Michael Graves, we find the defendant not guilty." A pause, then Michael's head dropped, not in shame, in disbelief, like the weight he'd carried had finally fallen off. He looked down at Shadow. Shadow looked back, and for the first time since the trial began, his tail moved. Not wildly, not playful, just one slow wag. "Enough." The judge cleared his throat. "Furthermore, I move to enter into record an official commendation for K9078, Shadow, for his role in alerting, identifying and contributing to the discovery of suppressed evidence that exonerated the defendant." The court stood, even the jury, not by order, but out of instinct. Shadow didn't understand the words, but he felt the moment, and in his quiet, proud stance, he looked exactly like the partner he'd once protected. Officer Alan Rowe wasn't there to see it, but in that moment, everyone else did. The grave was simple, no marble, no grandeur, just a wooden plaque, faded by weather. Officer Alan Rowe, beloved partner, trusted friend, fallen, not forgotten. The grass was overgrown, leaves scattered across the soil, and the world had moved on. But not Shadow. He sat beside the grave. Still, straight. Michael stood behind him, a bouquet in hand. They had walked there together. No leash, no command, just understanding. Michael knelt and placed the flowers gently on the earth. He looked at the plaque, voice soft. "You were the reason I became who I was, and he is the reason I never gave up." He looked at Shadow. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, but there was a weight in his chest that no heartbeat could hide. He sniffed the ground, then pressed his nose against the cold metal tag nailed into the wood. It was his, Shadow's, badge number. Michael had engraved it into the grave marker himself. One final connection. One final oath. A breeze passed through the cemetery, rustling the leaves like whispers of memory. Michael sat beside the dog, not speaking, not petting, just there, because sometimes the truest things aren't said aloud. And sometimes the most heroic stories are written without a single word. The auditorium was quiet, not from formality, but from reverence. Veterans lined the front rows. Police officers stood at attention. The air smelled faintly of brass and polished leather. At the center of the stage, a small podium and a cushion. And on that cushion, resting gently, was a medal. The inscription read, "For bravery beyond words, K9078, Shadow. Loyal to the end." Michael stood at the mic. He wasn't wearing his old uniform. He came as a man, not a detective, not a defendant, just a witness. He didn't need a voice to speak the truth. He didn't need hands to carry justice. He never turned away. Not from danger, not from loss, not from me. His voice cracked, but he continued. Shadow saved my life more than once, not just in the courtroom, but in the silence, in the guilt, in the days I didn't believe I'd see sunlight again. He stepped back. Shadow was led up the ramp slowly, not because he was weak, but because even heroes age. His fur had grayed slightly around the muzzle. His gait was slower, but his eyes still sharp, still present. As he reached the cushion, he sat. The crowd stood, and the medal was pinned, not to his collar, but placed gently in front of him. Shadow didn't move, but his tail tapped twice on the wood stage. Once for Roe, once for Michael. The audience didn't clap, not at first, because they all understood. Some stories don't end with noise. They end with silence, filled with meaning. And that day, Shadow wore no uniform, but he wore something greater: respect. Weeks passed. The medal sat in a wooden box on the mantel. Next to it, a photo of Officer Alan Rowe and Shadow, caught mid-patrol, both eyes focused on something unseen. Michael often sat on the porch now, Shadow just beside him, not in his usual stance, not alert, not rigid, just at peace. Sometimes they'd watch the wind play with the leaves. Other times they'd listen to the train whistle echo in the distance. Neither spoke, but then again, they never needed word. One evening, as the sky turned that perfect shade of gold, Shadow didn't rise from his spot when Michael stood. Instead, he tilted his head. Michael turned back. "You staying?" Shadow blinked once. Michael smiled. He didn't call for him. He let him rest. Later that night, he returned with a blanket. But Shadow hadn't moved, just breathing. Slow, deep, eyes closed, chest rising. Then still, Michael knelt beside him, placed a hand gently over his fur. Still warm, but silent. No pain, no noise, just peace. They buried him beside Roe. Same cemetery, same marker style. Simple, quiet, but beneath Shadow's plaque, one sentence stood alone. "He remembered what we forgot." And Michael, he still walks the porch, still sits alone, with 2 mugs of coffee. But he's not alone, because some bonds once forged never leave. They become shadow and light, memory and silence, a final watch, carried on forever. A year later, the town had changed. New faces, new shops. The world had moved on, but some stories refused to fade. At the edge of the city park stood a bronze statue, life-sized, detailed, eternal. It showed a man in uniform, kneeling, one hand resting gently on the head of a black German shepherd. The dog's eyes lifted, alert, just as he'd always been. Beneath the statue, a plaque read, "Shadow, K9." He didn't speak, he didn't judge, he remembered. And because of that, truth was never silenced. Michael often walked by, sometimes with school children asking questions. Was he real? They'd ask. Michael would smile, look at the statue, and say, "He was more real than most people I've known." They'd nod. Some would pet the metal snout, and just for a second, the wind would shift, as if something unseen was still watching, still listening, still waiting. Because Shadow may be gone, but the mission he completed will outlive them all. Not every hero barks, not every witness speaks, but some never forget. And if you're quiet enough, just enough, you might still hear it, the low, steady heartbeat of a dog who remembered everything.